The identities of peoples mentioned in this video have been changed out of respect for the privacy of said peoples. Except for one. Fuck you, Janine. Well, here I am, almost to 100 subs. Color me impressed. You know, I was toying with the notion of what I should do for a special to show my appreciation. I considered doing something along the lines of playing a special game or reviewing a special movie, but considering that's already the main focus of my channel, I figured I'd share some stories or life experiences. Just give you all a little look into the strange life that I've lived. This time around, I'm going to be telling you about a previous job that I had, and the experiences in working there, and why you need to stay far, far away from that company. Or at least one factory in particular. Now, I'm going to try talking about my experiences at Dynatech from a chronological standpoint, meaning that the events that I'll be describing are in the order that they happened. I may have forgotten some of the lesser details of working there, but a lot of the stuff mentioned has really stuck with me over the past few years, due to the absurd and insane nature of it all. So, Dynatech, a company formerly known as Gortrak, is a manufacturing plant which specializes in creating equipment for vehicles. More specifically, these tracks that protect the wires on the vehicles. Safety equipment, as they call it. I think it was around maybe 3 or 4 years ago that I started working there, making about $16 an hour with dental and vision care. And I left after a year and a half of service due to shenanigans that were taking place on the night shift, and opted to go back to working in a restaurant until I could find a better gig. Now, you may think it's strange for someone who's making $16 an hour with benefits to leave and go back to something as unsubstantial as kitchen work, but trust me, you will understand my reasons soon enough. Okay, so about a week after I send in my application and resume to the company, I get a call on my phone asking me if I could come in for an interview. And Janine, the person in charge of HR, is running me through the basics. What type of work is expected of me, guidelines in the handbook, dress code, you know, just going through the motions. Appearance-wise, she was pretty much like a South Park Snooki. A real living caricature of that monstrosity. So that's probably what I'll be referring to her as throughout this whole ordeal. Now, I'm not typically one to rag on someone's appearance, but in this case, I'm going to trudge along with this. I can assure you, this woman doesn't deserve any type of respect, and will receive none from me in this rant after all the shit that she got up to. So, we talk up and back about my potential employment there, and I ask her, well, what does work look like on the weekend? Because I like to have at least 2 days off to recuperate, spend some time with my family, and just have some me time. So she tells me that while we do have the weekends off, there is periodic overtime. Okay, not a big fan of overtime, but that's nothing I can't handle. You know, every now and then they stay after, catch things up, so I tell her that I'm interested and she sets up a date for me to come in during the day shift, since they train all their new workers during the day. This is like standard procedure from what I've observed of other factories, so everything's just gonna be peachy, right? Wrong. You know, looking back on this whole situation, I'm honestly amazed that I lasted there as long as I did. Because right from the beginning, shit was fucked. The person that they paired me up with as a trainer, we're just gonna call him Masao, ironically another fitting caricature for the person in question, only aged up by about 3 decades. Anyway, this guy was a real mess-up of an individual, rude, pretentious, and clearly didn't want the responsibility of training me. Which, honestly, he was already shirking his duties on. Basically, his idea of training was, here's the blueprint, here's this paperwork, figure it out, if you can't handle it, go home. Yeah, that's real helpful for someone brand new to the company. You know, I'm more of a visual learner, that's the easiest way for me to interpret information, but if I don't know what the fuck I'm looking at, then there are going to be problems. And it didn't help the day we were doing some cleaning and inventory that this motherfucker straight up yanked the broom out of my hands because I was doing it wrong. Yeah, I'm not really sure how you can mess up sweeping, but anyway. I miraculously ended up passing my training, no thanks to Masao, and got moved over to the night shift, my preferred time to work since I'm more of a nocturnal person. And it wouldn't be until almost 2 months later that I would find out that the guy got fired after my training. But it wasn't because he was neglecting his duties and training me. Do you know what he did get fired for? He passed out in the parking lot with a bottle of vodka shattered next to his car. Yeah, it turns out that the guy was coming to work drunk, and that's why he was in such a pissed off mood the whole time. Anyway, the first couple of weeks go by okay. It's practically a skeleton crew of me and 2 or 3 other people on the shift. I'm partnered up with one of the other workers building these tracks. I get to have my radio going, listening to some of my favorite game soundtracks and bands. Everything is awesome. Then we start to hire on some entitled children just out of high school and a couple of Karens. The first one I had the displeasure of working with was the Karen. The Karen, who we are just going to call Karen for simplicity's sake, brought it upon herself to complain about my music. I think I was listening to the Persona 5 soundtrack around the time, but that's besides the point. Anyway, the supervisor of the shift asked me to put on something else. The issue with music is going to come back later again, and it's going to be just as stupid explaining the circumstances the second time around. So I turn off the soundtrack, and I go to put on something else. And I settle on the Ramones, since the supervisor was adamant that I play quote-unquote real music. But, surprise, surprise, little Miss Karen does one of the most childish things imaginable. She throws down her power tools and starts walking for the door, threatening to quit if I don't play something that she likes. You know, there's only one real way of handling a situation like this. Let me ask you, if you're employing someone and they threaten not to work for you because they can't have it their way, what would you do? If your answer is walking them straight out the door and telling them that their services are no longer required, then hats off to you. If your response is to enable them and cave to their stupid demands, then congratulations! You're such a stupid motherfucker you'll feel right at home working for this company. Seriously, this woman was in her 40s at the least, and she opted to act like a child just because she couldn't have her way. Honestly, what was more annoying were these kids fresh out of high school acting like little punks. Using air hoses to launch different assembly pieces as projectiles at one another, carving shit into the tables and the machines. Now, if you guys think that drinking on the job, childish Karens, and vandalism is bad, just wait until you hear about all the sexual assault stuff. Oh yeah, there was a lot of that going on as well. And from a female employee, no less. On multiple occasions, me and several other of the male employees got our asses smacked, and had several other inappropriate comments made towards us by a girl who had transferred from the day shift to night shift. And of course, since she was dating the supervisor for Metals Division, she got away with it all in spite of many stops and leave me alones. Honestly, what was more infuriating than the sexual stuff was the fact that she thought she ran the place. Yeah, you move in from another shift and suddenly you start barking orders about what everyone else needs to do because your entitled ass is sucking the dick of the supervisor. Now, with all this shit building up, I'm going out of my fucking mind and I'm close to snapping. You see, I used to be a bit more soft-spoken for fear of hurting people's feelings and leaving a bad impression. I mean, I always was opinionated, but I kept most of that stuff to myself because that's a decent thing to do. Avoid conflicts and try not to make a bad impression. But now, honestly, I'm like, who the fuck cares? If someone is going to be foul towards you, then dish it back to them. Why would you want to protect the feelings of some twerp who mentally and emotionally tortures you to the point of you having a panic attack? That's what happened next. So, in addition to all this childish, inept mediocrity, we were working 10 to 11 hour shifts. Now, they like to classify these as 9-hour shifts because apparently they don't count breaks as actual work, as well as mandatory Saturdays. You may recall the conversation with old South Park Snooki earlier in the interview, where she said we would be doing some overtime and have the weekends off. Well, turns out that was a fucking lie. In addition to having to deal with the drama of these other boneheads, everyone had the dog shit worked out of them. And through all of this drama, and some of the shit that was going on in my personal life as well, my legs gave out, I began stuttering, could hardly breathe, and I was crying. 2 of the other co-workers actually had to carry me out of the factory so my parents could pick me up and take me to the hospital to get me checked out. So the doctor checks me out and chalks it up to stress after I report the incident, and he tells me I should take a few days off work, so I do. I spend most of the following day in bed, and who comes calling? Miss South Park Snooki is there to throw in her 2 cents with the most insulting diagnosis from pretentious Karen. Do you know what this brainless bitch had the nerve to say to me?
We don't want this to happen again, so you better stop playing your video game.
Seriously, who the fuck says something like that to a worker who was literally carried out of the building and sent to a hospital from stress that could have been completely avoided if only the people in charge were more competent? I think I mentioned to her once that I enjoyed the hobby of gaming during my interview, and the only reason that she tried to bring that up was because she knew damn well that the company's environment was toxic and exhausting. But of course she can't admit to the faults of the people she works for, so scapegoat a hobby. It's the same thing that irresponsible douchebag parents say when their kid commits armed robbery or does drugs. Blame literally everything except for the issue. Guns, video games, TV, literally everything except for the issue at hand. Real talk, if gaming was such a problem or addiction for me, then how the hell was I able to hold down a job to begin with? Let me reiterate my earlier point. The only reason why I am not working for these jokers is because of their poor policies and their abusive way that they treat their employees. If it weren't for that, I would probably have stuck around. But at the end of the day, I'd rather be making substantially less with a company who actually values their employees than stick around with these assholes while constantly feeling like I should take another attempt on my life. Anyway, after that whole ordeal, things went back to normal. Or what passes for normal at that company. And the girl I mentioned, we're just going to call her Marge. Marge is still trying to call the shots, even though she was only an assembler, just like the rest of us. And she took it upon herself to shut my radio off on me whenever I would step away from the table to use the restroom. She constantly berated my choice in music, and complained to some of the higher-ups about it. Hell, there was one time that I actually came in on shift, started playing my music while I was working on an assembly table, and I just so happened to be partnered up with Marge. She came to the table, turned her radio on after me, and I'm thinking, alright, she wants to listen to her tunes too, not a big deal. But it wasn't long before orders were getting barked at me about how I needed to turn it off because she was there first. Even though she wasn't there first.
Do you have any kids?
No. Lucky for them.
What? So Marge's outburst caused the supervisors and line lead to show up, and even the plant manager and HR threw in their 2 cents in on it as well, because they happened to be within earshot of her temper tantrum. I don't remember exactly how it played out after that, if I just got partnered with somebody else or what, but I do remember Snooki's comment on the matter.
We're not gonna be having any battle of the bands anymore.
Was it a battle? I'm pretty sure this was just some entitled bitch starting drama because she couldn't have things her way. On and off, I'd have to listen to her getting her digs in. Why don't you listen to normal music? Oh, this band is trash. Evanescence is better. Stop playing things I don't like. Blah, blah, blah. Well, eventually the line lead got sick of her complaining, so naturally he told her to cut it out and just be respectful of other people's preferences. Except that's not what happened. Why? Because since she's blowing the supervisor, that means she gets a free pass. No, instead, he decided to align himself with her. Now, we're gonna call this guy Fat Einstein. Probably one of my favorite people to work with on the job. The guy was on the heavy side and a genius. In addition to having owned his own computer company for the longest time, he also knew the ins and outs of that job as well. I think he was working there for about 5 years. Now, you're probably thinking to yourself, what? You actually got along with this guy even though he took sides with Marge? Well, I wasn't happy about it. I even snapped at the guy as a result. But looking back, I can't really blame him. As we already established, Marge was dating the supervisor and couldn't really be reprimanded. Hell, she was getting away with sexual assault on the shift. What do you think would have happened to him if he had taken my side? He probably would have ended up getting terminated as a result. So, after snapping at Einstein and Marge, the radios got shut off for the night and for the very last time. After having one too many complaints about the music, the plant manager decided that no one is going to be allowed to listen to their radios, and we should be stuck listening to whatever he chose to play on the loudspeaker through a company MP3 player. Of course, since even the supervisor thought this was bullshit, we ended up picking and choosing our own songs to play through his MP3 instead. You know, since the plant manager isn't active during nights, so we can get away with it. Huh. You know, that's probably why all this other shit was going down too. So we're picking and choosing music, going back and forth, taking turns, but Marge wouldn't miss her chance to blame me for the radios getting taken away, saying that it was because of my music that the privileges got revoked. Oh, but don't forget, Vinny, I'm your friend and I care about you. Yeah, so in addition to being a sexually abusive, self-centered swine, she also liked to gaslight. Yeah, never mind the dehumanization both behind my back and in front of me, she's totally my friend. So morale is getting lower since practically everyone is pissed off about the music, mandatory Saturdays, you know, the days we were supposed to get off anyway according to Snooki. Fuck that bitch. And the constant overtime, which we had to do for almost 7 months in a row now, except for the small handful of workers who came up with the idea of slacking off so they can indefinitely get more overtime to thereby make more income. Just wait until we get to one of those guys. And I'm starting to look for a new job. I'm reaching the end of my rope with these boneheads, so I request a day off so I can have an interview with this other company. And Marge is the first one to give me crocodile tears about how she doesn't want to see me go. You know, even though she saw fit to dehumanize me and blame me for her fuck-ups. And I got pulled aside by one of the team leads and supervisor the following day. And the conversation went something along the lines of, "Hey, we really need you here. If you leave now, we're gonna be screwed. Maybe we could come to some sort of an arrangement." I hated that horseshit environment, but I was good at my job. This may come off as a little pretentious to anyone who didn't see me in action, but I was probably one of the best workers on that shift. There was actually one time where I single-handedly got everyone to get a Saturday off by making a number of tracks in the allotted time that we were given from the supervisor. A little incentive he gave us for us to do our best. Well, me being a dumbass, I decided to take an under-the-table deal from them to get every other Saturday off so I can recuperate from the stress and spend some time with my family. This was a mistake, because things only got worse from that point on. Sure, I was able to recuperate to an extent, but it still didn't help that we were slammed with excessive overtime and we still had to deal with the drama that was unfolding on shift. Marge was still bossing pretentious Swit. The supervisor, who I'm just going to call Mr. Thornton, one of the only other people who I genuinely liked being around, was too nice and lenient to do anything to reprimand her. Everyone else was pissed off that they were pissed off, and all the new workers who didn't have a high threshold for bullshit were just walking themselves out days after getting employed. And honestly, I can only think of one time that I was glad to see one of these people leave. Now, for the most part, the metal section of the factory was composed of men. And it always went back to that same status quo because Marge seemed to be competitive with other girls, trying to run them off the shift, which she successfully did about 3 times since I was employed there. Now, the first time I honestly can't complain because the girl in question was quite the obnoxious troglodyte. She was one of those. You know the kind. Weighing in by about 400 pounds, blue hair, face like a bulldog. And this part I may be speculating on since I never actually saw it, but based on her unbridled disdain for white men, coupled with the fact that she was asking people to introduce her to a cute black guy on the other end of the factory, I'm assuming that she had one of those little tramp stamps. And now I reflect on how when I initially met her, I had the decency to compliment her on her hair, since it reminded me of Kurumu. Sorry, Miss Kuruno, I have clearly done you a disservice by ever making such a comparison. We're gonna call her Buffalo Heifer instead. So she was there for a while, lazy as can be, talking about people behind their back. I even got a few reports back to me about how she was calling me a retard. Probably because I'm a white man and she probably didn't know that I was bi. But I guess eventually she couldn't take the heat from Marge, so Buffalo Heifer left us. And now she's out roaming where the deer and the antelope play. Or maybe she moved to Harlem. I don't fucking know. So Marge did one good thing, point to her for that. But these other 2 people she ran off, not so cool. I can't remember the names of the other 2 girls, but I do remember the faces. One of them was a cute Mexican girl, I'm going to call her Augustina, who I enjoyed talking to about music, horror movies, and horror books. Then there was a single mother who I don't know how to phrase this without coming off as offensive. She wasn't a bad person, but she was a white trash hillbilly. Let's call her Jennifer. Anyway, before targeting the latter, Marge was getting on Augustina's case about how she was moving too slow, among other things, talking behind her back and in front of it as she did. So, Augustina, lasting there a much shorter time than Buffalo Heifer, ended up leaving. And it really sucked seeing her go. Then last, but I'm sure certainly not least, we move on to Jennifer. Not sure if I mentioned this earlier, but there was an awful lot of locker room talk going on in that factory, which Jennifer was also engaged in. And this is what Marge used to get her fired. She went straight to Snooki with the allegations that Jennifer was making people uncomfortable and being creepy, even though it's not like she and everyone else didn't talk the same way. And within a fucking day, she was gone. Let me remind you, this is the same person who was grabbing people on the ass without their consent. The same person who was raising hell and doing everything that she shouldn't have been doing simply because she could get away with it since she was fucking the supervisor. And the same fucking rapist who grabbed me and kissed me in spite of dehumanizing me for personal likes. Did I mention that little detail earlier? I'm trying to write this down as it happened chronologically, but I don't remember if I mentioned that detail. Marge grabbed me and kissed me on the cheek, and honestly, I don't know what was going through her mind. And it really speaks to my self-control that my fist didn't go through it following those events. And now we are back. I think I'm just about at the midway point of the story and closely coming to a conclusion, so let's get on with it. So far I have talked about irresponsible drunks training people, whiny crybabies threatening to quit for not getting things their way, sexual assault, vandalism, and slander. Did I leave anything out? Oh yeah, complacent workers. We touched on that briefly when I mentioned the people that were deliberately slacking off just to make more money and keep overtime going indefinitely. But the one that got under my skin the most was a guy we're just going to call Crip Glover. This guy was one of the worst types of lazy workers. The only effort that he put into his work was the effort to not do work. Walking away from the table every 20 minutes, moving at a snail's pace, trying to get me to do his work for him since I was faster, and wandering off into the loading dock to inspect the final product, even though it wasn't his fucking job to do that anyway. And already got past quality control. That was a short and sweet touch on complacency, but now that we have that out of the way, let's talk about the safety concerns. It's no secret that if you're working in a factory, there are going to be risks involved. You may get concussed, hopefully you don't end up losing a limb, but there's definitely a possibility of that. You may drill a hole through your hand, you could get burned, get metal splinters, hit by a forklift. It all comes with the territory. But all of these accidents that happened at this place could have been very easily avoided. Remember Masao, that drunk guy who trained me? Let's rewind a bit back to my 4th week on the job. Remember how I said that he basically left me to figure out how to assemble, do paperwork, and lift the tracks by myself? Remember how I said I'm more of a visual learner? Well, on the 4th week, after observing how they moved the tracks, I lifted one such track to move to the quality control table. And I lifted it the wrong way, so it ended up smacking me on the head. I tasted blood, and my vision went black for a moment. Could have possibly killed me if I was unlucky enough. To my knowledge, they never wrote up an accident report, and Masao was never held accountable for his negligence either. They just waited until they found him passed out with a broken bottle of booze weeks later before they decided to let him go. This was only the first of many quote-unquote accidents that occurred on the shift. Marge ended up getting a piece of welded metal embedded in her heel after a spark flew off of one of the welding machines. The morning line lead, who was sticking around after that day, saw her screaming in pain, but just stood there not doing anything for the longest time, thinking that she was joking. People were leaving impact guns hanging from hoses suspended from the ceiling for people to walk into, leaving stomping boards on the ground for people to trip on, and a guy actually cut his fingers off. Oh yeah, we actually had a dismemberment in the building. Just wait until you hear how it happened, though. This is just fucking beautiful. So in Plastics Division, where they mold some of the other parts for the plastic tracks, I guess they have a saw. I'm not really sure what you would call it. Maybe, like, subsonic? Anyway, it's a quiet saw that barely makes any noise until you run something through it. And one of the supervisors in that section of the factory instructed the intern to clean the saw while it was running. And to take the safety guards off to better clean it. Why in the fuck would you take safety guards off of a saw? This massacre of the intern's digits could have been completely avoided if the supervisor had a functioning brain. And you know, I have to wonder what the company did to sweep this under the rug too. There was no meeting to lecture on the safety, even though the higher-ups lord about how it's the most important thing over production. The incident was never reported to OSHA, even though I'm pretty sure you would have to report something this serious. And people pretended like it never happened afterwards. So I would have to assume that the company either paid the guy off to keep his mouth shut, or the more likely event, they found a way to threaten him, since these assholes would do anything to save a buck. Even my supervisor commented to me about how the higher-ups don't care, and even if you cut your foot off, if you miss work for too long, you'll get fired. Back when I was venting to him about the poor work conditions and policies. Now, for those of you who think I'm making any of this shit up as fodder for my video, or think I'm exaggerating the complacency and lax safety conditions, just take a look at this. This was one of the products that we made. The tracks that I keep mentioning, notice anything off about it? Take a good look. For those of you who don't know, when you build a track on an assembly table, you put down a pin, then place two links on top of one another, followed by a washer, and then a snap ring to keep it held together. Look at how this snap ring is positioned. People built this and got it past quality control. People got paid to build this and passed it through quality control. And this isn't like the thing was improperly manufactured on the table. This was passed by quality control and hanging up with the rest of the products cleared for assembly. I pulled this from the rack myself. If this thing broke apart mid-transit to the barring table, that link could have given out at any moment and could have put a gash or cut into anyone who was handling it. It's not like it's an act of God situation either, where the assembly tools could have malfunctioned. The two tools that they give you for working on the tracks is a snap ring gun and a pair of snap ring pliers. The gun will only work if the nipple is placed directly in the center of the pin, and it would have enveloped it normally like these ones. The pliers were used for some supporting pins on the brackets, which were made of solid pieces and didn't have a divot for the gun to rest over it. Whoever built this was screwing around with snap ring pliers, making a deliberate attempt to get it this way. And yet, somehow this got past QC. They signed off on it and everything. Policy for building these things is that both the builder and the person doing quality control have to sign their initials on the track before it could get cleared for further assembly. It's laughable how unprofessional these workers there acted. Oh, and they fired Einstein too. Yeah. The hardworking guy who was one of the few intellectuals on the shift. The guy who was loyal to the company for years. They just let him go. Why? Well, it's because someone was making up false allegations about him sleeping on duty. I bet we can all guess who was behind that now, can't we? Without even holding an investigation to see if this was true or not, Snooky booted him out without hesitation. The one guy who knew how everything in the factory worked. Hell, this guy was teaching me how to build some more heavy-duty tracks before the end. A part of the job that I liked more than the others, due to its isolation from stupidity. So, with Einstein gone, the position of quality control went to another guy who we're just going to call Ulysses, and I was tasked with working on the XL tracks, those heavy-duty ones that I was being trained on. But occupying that little slice of heaven was very short-lived, because all of a sudden, people were finding flaws in my work. Yeah, I did have a few hiccups on these things periodically. After all, I was still being trained by Einstein before he was unjustly sacked. But I was being treated like I was solely to blame. Hey, here's an idea. Maybe you shouldn't have fired the one guy who knew what the fuck he was doing, just because you have your own little agenda. Also, maybe you should remove Ulysses from QC since he approved of my work! That's the other problem with this situation. I admit, I fucked up on occasion. Everyone makes mistakes. But when your job as a QC is to catch other people's mistakes, and you repeatedly send through faulty products, you don't belong in a QC position. That's why I turned the position down when it was offered to me. I didn't want that kind of pressure or responsibility. So everything is getting progressively worse as things went on, but this is the part that caused me to walk off the job and seek employment elsewhere. About 2 or 3 days after getting moved off XL tracks and back to the barring and building table, I get confronted by Marge, Ulysses, and Snooky, telling me to come to the HR office. So, when I sit down, the first thing that Snooky does is demand that I remove my mask, even though we had the options to wear them if it made us more comfortable. Then, she followed with,
So, you're handing yourself just to get off of work, huh?
and I'm just like, what? I didn't even know how to respond to this at first. I was confused. This socially inept whore accused me of deliberately hurting myself on the job just to get out of work. This is honestly pissing me off reflecting on this. I don't know exactly what was going on in this bitch's brain to make such an outrageous claim, but get this. She was getting reports from people out on the floor about how I was getting hit in the head with impact guns or walking into things deliberately. Remember I mentioned the impact guns earlier? When assembling certain parts on the track, we occasionally had to use these tools to get bolts secured into the tracks. And the hoses are suspended from the ceiling. Now, instead of disengaging the impact gun from the hose when they were done using it, they left the tool dangling in midair for anyone to smack their heads on. When I explained this to her, she said,
Oh, well, you just need to be aware of your surroundings.
No bitch! When you have something that is hanging just outside of your line of vision, that is a safety hazard. What do you expect me to do? Look at the ceiling all day to keep an eye out for dangers that shouldn't be there to begin with? These things were just out of sight enough that you couldn't see them if you were looking straight ahead, but low enough to smack you on the forehead if you ran into them if you were the average height adult. I already had to be on alert for forklifts going down the aisles when I was retrieving parts for the tracks, and keep an eye on the floors to make sure that the stomping boards people left out all the time wouldn't trip me up. So I'm trying to keep my eyes on both the floor and what's ahead of me, and when I'm trying to explain this to her, Ulysses pretty much just tells me to shut the fuck up and listen to her so we could get back to work. Yeah, don't allow me the opportunity to defend myself and my actions. I should just shut up and let this slander fly. Slander that got even worse when she said that people were witnessing me playing games on my phone in the restroom. Hello, 911. Yes, I'd like to report some coworkers for participating in unwilling voyeurism. I honestly should have called the police about this. I should have also reported her for not allowing me to face my accuser, which would pretty much be aiding and abetting if what she claimed actually did happen. Again, this was quote-unquote witnessed by my coworkers. Apparently people were peeking in on me while I was taking a shit. I'm not sure if that's a felony, but unwilling voyeurism is illegal. Now, I don't know if people were actually peeking in on me or not, since I was stupid enough not to have this investigated at the time, but I can say for sure that I definitely was not playing games in there. Oh, but wait, it gets even more ridiculous. As Janine finished slandering me, you know what, I'm just gonna go back to using her name. I hope the higher-ups see this video and I hope she gets fired. Fuck protecting the identity of her out of respect. I have zero respect for this cunt. As Janine finished slandering me, she then told me that I would have to get a doctor's note if I was in the restroom for more than 3 minutes. Oh yeah. She was actually trying to impose a restriction on me going to the restroom because being in there for over 3 minutes was too long. I actually had to defend the fact that depending on what you eat, you may be in there for longer than 3 minutes. So, what did she do? She tried to enforce what types of foods I can eat.
Okay, if you're gonna be in there that long, you can't have this, or this.
You know what? Scratch the Janine thing, I'm just gonna call her Hitler now. Since we had the privilege of ordering DoorDash for lunch on break, and I was making more money than I am now, I was ordering things like carry-out steaks from Chili's and some hot wings. And that was going to be a no-go in her eyes. You have to find something else to eat so you don't take longer than 3-minute shits so we can exploit you to the fullest. Now, Hitler didn't actually say that part about exploitation, but you know damn well that's what was on her mind. So, I bring up the fact that OSHA law says that you can't enforce unreasonable restrictions on restroom use, and, as I'm explaining this, she cuts me off and says,
These aren't unreasonable restrictions, and you are gonna shut up, stop interrupting me, and let me finish talking.
Yeah, let's look over this again. First, you falsely accuse me of intentionally bringing harm to myself to get out of work, even though it would have been just as easy for me to either call off or straight up quit and find another job. You allegedly have people participating in voyeurism, or people at least lying about witnessing me taking a shit. You try to enforce unreasonable restrictions on me being able to use the restroom, because apparently I'm in there too long, even though it's not like you can really control something like that. You try to control what types of food I can order for lunch, and then when I try to explain my side of things, you tell me to shut up and just accept what you have to say? 2 days after this ordeal is when I left. I figured I would at least talk to the plant manager directly and tell him what was going on, letting him know that people were spreading false rumors, which he himself called a meeting about in the past, and said that there would be a zero-tolerance policy on it. But for this situation, he did nothing. So, finally fed up with all this drama and childish behavior of everyone in that factory, I walked out halfway through my shift. And, as I was walking out the door to the parking lot, I get stopped by Marge, who is feigning sadness again, trying to get me to talk things out. Yeah, because that worked so well before when the Hitler bitch told me to just shut up and accept all that she had to say. There was no possible way of working this out. And even if they did try to make another under-the-table deal with me like they did in the past, I wouldn't take it. Sure, I miss the money, now since my current job is making substantially less, but I'll take that place over a place that is lax on safety, tolerates harassment, both sexual and otherwise, fires people on a whim for things that they haven't even done, and have complete morons in charge of human resources and quality control. Anyway, that was my experience with this company. I can't say for sure what other branches are like since they have a few other factories around the globe, but the one that I was working at really needs to be looked at. Hard. I can only imagine what other shit they're getting away with these days. When I do more of these stories in the future, I don't think they'll be quite this long, but I wanted to make sure that I got a record of all, if not most, of the atrocities that are going on at that place before the memories fade from my brain completely. And, as I cram my noggin with more pleasant work and life experiences, hopefully these thoughts will leave very soon. And here endeth the video. I have quite a few more life experiences and stories I intend to tell you viewers in the future, but that's going to be a ways away. Let's say, somewhere after I reach 300 subs? So, stay tuned for the next story on why you should never buy sex toys 20 miles away from home in a rainstorm. It's just as hilarious as it sounds.